Hey guys, it's Nick. Welcome to another episode of T-365. Today's episode, I'm going to be covering a deep dive of the new commerce experience from Microsoft. It's definitely one of the most emotional topics out there today. Definitely a lot to unpack, so I wanted to create this episode to walk through all the terms, the transition path, PSA considerations, and everything like that, just so you have a better understanding moving into the new year. So with that, let's go ahead and dive in here. I want to start off first with some of the basics about what NCE is and how it came about within the channel here. So essentially, NCE has been around since 2019. We had what was called Azure Plan, and many of you may be already on this today for your Azure subscriptions, but this was the first transition we had to make. There wasn't a huge operational change or billing change that took effect here. You simply transitioned through an API in most cases to this new Azure Plan. You got access to things like the Azure Cost Manager, which was a benefit, but no huge operational change occurred for you. It's a little bit different with the 365 subscriptions, as you'll see here if you're not familiar with NCE already. But essentially here, Microsoft's really trying to simplify the customer journey here of which they can transact and procure Microsoft subscriptions. So if you think about the ways in which they can transact today, the first of which is going to be direct. That's just purchasing directly from Microsoft. Second of which could be an EA agreement. This is multi-year agreements for bulk discounts on licensing, typically only for more seats in a customer environment, like 500 to 1,000 at least. And then number three, which is where you are all probably living today, is CSP, and that's being an indirect provider or an indirect reseller. Most cases you today are an indirect reseller, getting a portion of the margin and reselling the 365 services down to your customers. What Microsoft's trying to do here, because there's complexities with each channel in that they have different billing terms, different rate plans, different methods of which a customer can transact through a user interface, trying to simplify that to one customer agreement. So essentially here we're eliminating all these different channels and we're making it a single channel in which they can transact today, and that is simplifying not only their journey, but also if they were to transition between different partners or different experiences like moving from a partner to direct or vice versa, it's more of a simplified journey for them. Microsoft also touts some benefits for the partner in that because you're looking at longer contract terms, you have more customer profitability. But we'll see, and if you already are familiar with, there's a lot of controversy there as well too, because a lot of what we're used to today in CSP is flexibility, which is kind of being taken out with new commerce. So with that, let's start to pivot into the terms here so you guys can see some of the major changes that are going to be coming down the line and some of the more emotional topics of which is part of NCE. So with NCE you have a new term here which is 3-year. Traditionally we've always had monthly and annuals, but 3 years in multi-year agreements is something that's traditionally only been in EA agreements. So that's new to the CSP program here now as well. With our payment options, pretty straightforward in this sense. We have monthlies that you can pay monthly. For your annuals, you can now pay annuals monthly, but you're committed for that annual term. Or you can prepay. And then with 3 years, you also have that flexibility to pay monthly or annual or prepay. So essentially here you have some flexibility, but you have to ultimately honor those commitments. You're financially obligated to honor those commitments. Now when we get into pricing here, this is where some of the controversial topics come into play. Monthlies are now going to be 20% premium over annuals. Meaning that if you want this flexibility of a monthly agreement where you aren't on the hook for that full year term for the quantity that you purchase for subscriptions, you have to pay a 20% premium over the annual costs, which will be about what they are today. The only difference here is that in March we're going to experience a price uptick. Only for certain SKUs though, so there's a heavy asterisk on that. Microsoft is going to fully release that come January because they realized there was a bunch of price discrepancies in the SKUs that they had there. 15% sometimes increase, but we need to wait until January to see that fully for a lot of these SKUs. One that we know of today is business premiums moving up from $20 a SKU price point USD to 22, so it's about a 10% increase there, but you will be seeing that as far as the uptick come in March. And I'll be getting into more of the promos here to avoid that uptick in a later part of this video. The 3-year though is also extending this price uptick, but again, it's not a 20% premium as well too. The other controversial topic is the cancellation options. Right now you have 72 hours to cancel, which is essentially saying that whenever you increment your seats or whenever you order net new, you have 72 hours to go ahead and cancel that subscription or cancel your modification before you're fully committed. Now with monthly, that's not too big of a deal, right? Because we're only on that monthly term, we're only on the hook for that month. But with annuals, we have that full commitment term. So we have to understand that we're financially liable for any of those increments there go. And after 72 hours, we can't do any decrements or anything like that because we are on the hook for those full term charges. The other complexity here is that they're going to be giving a prorated refund within that 72-hour window, not just a full refund. So you get into complexities of when you actually go ahead and revert those changes or cancel, you're going to get a prorated refund based off of the point in time that you do that. So next here we have seat changes. Essentially, with monthlies you can have more flexibility. You're moving up monthly, and whenever you have this term, if you were to increment mid-month, you're going to have a prorated charge for that, much like you're familiar with today. And with annuals, you can only do increases during your term. So essentially it's saying I cannot decrease, I cannot get a prorated refund, I can only go up, I cannot go down. The same is true with your 3-year commits as well too. Once you establish your baseline at your anniversary date, that's what you got to stick with, that's what you're financially committed to, unless you were to cancel within that 72-hour window. So the big thing with all of this here is really essentially your anniversary dates that you have, but also the liability that you carry now as well too, just because you're on the hook for those subscriptions and you can't make any decrements and get some type of prorated refund. Next here, we have anniversary dates. This is also a new complexity that we have to deal with. Again, ripping out some of the flexibility with CSP, which is to say that we have single anniversary date per sub, which is essentially bringing a lot more operational complexity, and I'll unpack this more essentially as we go on. But it's essentially saying that you could have a customer with 3 separate subscriptions and 3 separate anniversary dates as well too. And the same here is true across the board. And I'll show you example next of what this will look like of an annual paid monthly type of term where you have increments throughout the year and what that exactly looks like. The increments though and your anniversary dates will all stay the same for your base level subscription, but it's on a single subscription basis. And then lastly here, your top benefits to monthly is obviously your flexibility. Your annuals here is the essential price savings. And then lastly, your 3-year is just price locking, which is saying that you're locking in the existing rates here for 3 years. But that's really the main benefit. I don't see this being a very attractive term in SMB just because of the concerns of the climate we're in right now essentially, but also just customers not wanting to commit for that long for subscriptions because of all the uncertainties with their business. So a lot of this has been unpacked as far as the high level changes go. There's definitely a lot of major operational complexity that we have to deal with that I'll be unpacking. But I want to give you a better visual as far as the annual paid monthly type of term, because I think is going to be one of the most attractive types that you will adopt as an MSP, just to walk through that whole process and the increments throughout the year. So with that, let's go ahead and pivot over and show that example. Okay, so let's get back into an annual paid monthly example here, just so you can see what it looks like from an anniversary date perspective and also seat change perspective midterm. Whenever you have this type of subscription here, let's just say you're going to go ahead and purchase Business Premium for a customer. And we're going to say that our initial quantity here is going to be 10 seats. And we're going to have the purchase date, or PD, set to 01/23/22, and that means that our anniversary date, in this case, our AD, is going to be 01/23/23. So essentially here we carry over that anniversary date, and now let's say midterm, we go ahead and we bump our seat count up by 2 because we got 2 new employees. So we have 12 seats now. Purchase date here, let's just go ahead and say that we have it on 07/20 of 22. Our anniversary date here, just take note of this, is still going to be 01/23/23. And then essentially what we're doing here is we're saying that there's going to be a prorated charge on that next invoice that we have here. So we're just going to essentially get a prorated charge of the plus 2 seats on the next invoice that we pay monthly, and then moving forward our bill is going to carry over that 12 seat count monthly paid annual on the invoice that we receive. Now whenever you have your anniversary date, that's when you can decrement without any type of penalty because you're not committing to anything. It's just truly when you readjust based off of the subscriptions that you have and the employee count that you need to accommodate for. So let's just say we're going to go back down to 10. Say -2, and on that date we're going to do it on our anniversary date. So we have 01/23/2023, and then our new anniversary date again here is still going to be 01/23 of 2024. So essentially here what you did is essentially moved up by 2 seats, you get a prorated charge on that next month's invoice. So in this case it would be in August or 8 from that perspective, and then you would carry forward your quantity of 12 on your new monthly charges that you have moving forward with the same anniversary date, and then on your anniversary date is when you can decrement, and then you'll have that as your commitment for the next year's term. So a lot of big changes there in that sense that you'll have to deal with. Obviously with monthlies, you can just do that on a monthly basis as far as your increments or decrements, but you're on the hook for those terms unless you move those without that 72-hour window you have for cancellations. So with that, I think it's good to now pivot into the operations side of the house, so you can see some of the changes there that you'll have to make from largely a PSA perspective, and we'll kind of walk through all of those, but also this new concept that we have, which is essentially co-terms for a single product. So with that, let's go ahead and pivot into the operations side. Okay, so getting into operations here, we have a lot of new headaches, honestly, with NC that we have to deal with just because of all the changes in terms and pricing and things of that nature. So with that, essentially here, first and foremost, your contracts really need to change with your customers, your MSA agreements. Essentially, you're going to modify the lingo there to accommodate for annuals unless you have the customer pay a premium for the monthlies. There's that 20% premium on monthlies, but if you do the annuals, obviously you're going to be on the hook for that from a liability standpoint. So you need the customer either prepay annual or commit to paying monthly, but being committed to that full term so you're not financially liable for those particular subscriptions. So first and foremost, you really need to adjust your contracts with this type of language so that the customer can sign off on being liable for those subscriptions, because ultimately you don't want that burden on you, especially not across all of your customers. The other consideration here is that obviously you're not going to know the fluctuations in employee count with your customers, So essentially you could have some co-terms, and I'll get to that more here in a second, but essentially you're looking at potentially having an annual term for full-time employees, but then also having some monthlies for seasonal workers where you know they're not going to be there full-time. And so it makes more sense to pay for the monthlies, because even with that premium, it'll be cheaper than that full annual. With your renewals here, you're essentially looking at different anniversary dates per customer, per subscription as well too. So we'll get to that more here also in a second with the co-terms. But essentially you have to have a type of automation, and I'll get to that in my recommendations, but you have to have some type of automation around when you're going to re-up with the customer, to check in with them to make sure that this is the exact quantity that we need at this time, because again, if we're doing annuals, we're going to be locked into that rate. So renewals are going to really grow in complexity at a per subscription level, not even just a per customer level. And with that, we have our co-terms here, which is essentially saying that for one product, for business premium for instance, we could have a monthly commit, we could have an annual commit, we could have an annual prepaid, we could have also a 3-year term on that same product for one customer. Essentially, you could have multiple terms here. So let's say you have customer XYZ here, and let's say they have 3 products currently. So they have business standard, they have Azure Information Protection, and they also have Defender for Office 365. Now each one of these here, they could have potentially monthly and an annual. To accommodate for seasonal workers as well as the full-time employees. And then each one of these could essentially have its own anniversary date. So in this example here, still simplified example, you could have 6 anniversary dates total for one customer, which is again bringing a huge amount of complexity to how not only we manage this from just a single customer perspective, but also how we bill out for it in our PSA tool as well too. And this is still simplified. You could still actually have the 3-year term, which I wouldn't recommend that you get into that type of complexity, but essentially it could grow in the sense of the actual anniversary dates you have for one customer. So this is really driving a lot of complexity and bringing this anniversary date complexity that we've never really experienced with CSP, because we've been on that monthly. Usually first of the month through the last of the month is when we're doing our cycle, and we have flexibility to prorate the increments throughout the month and just true them up. So lots of different changes here that we'll have to accommodate for depending on which methods that you're billing out to your customer, as well as the terms that you're selecting for that customer. Transition is also another complexity here from an operational standpoint. I'll get to the timelines here next, but essentially we're looking at new SKUs for NCE completely for 365 products, which means that you're going to have to convert every single subscription from your customers into NCE based off of what they're on today. Now if you're working with a distributor today, they're likely going to have some automation around this, where they have you just upgrade your subscription into NCE, and there will be a time frame that you have to work with essentially to move all these subscriptions over by a certain period of time, and I'll get to that next again. But again, just lots of manual labor to move all these subscriptions over from what they're at today to NCE. Lastly, and that kind of transitions greatly into the PSA side of the house. So when you think about this, you're going to have all new products, but you're also going to have these co-terms as well too. So essentially with PSA, you're going to have to create new products in your PSA tool to accommodate for a monthly subscription that's going to be 20% higher premium versus an annual paid monthly or an annual prepaid. So essentially you're going to have to create a new product SKU per term within PSA to be able to accommodate for that. And I would limit that obviously to what you're going to support selling to your customers, but it's still a headache to have to go then and create basically 3 or 4 different products per one product in Microsoft just to accommodate for the terms and the differences in rate plans per term. Your agreements and contracts you're going to have to modify as well too potentially. You might be now having customers move to annual prepaid just to reduce your liability. So where you were previously syncing Microsoft 365 agreements, or subscriptions I should say, to monthly agreements, you could now be syncing them to annuals. It's possible you could keep those the same, but essentially you would have to also close date out your existing subscriptions that you have today and add the new line items from the standpoint of the NCE products. I recommend doing the clean shift versus just updating existing with new products, just simply because of all the term changes, but also the rate plan changes that are coming not only for monthlies, but also the price uptick that's coming in the March timeframe as well too. The other big part here again is renewals, and since that's going to be variable per subscription per customer, you're going to have some type of method to automate that process as far as going in and making sure that the quantity looks good, having some notifications with your customer, more of a drip to say that, hey, in 30 days we're going to renew your annual, it's for 30 seats, you're fully committed for that. Is that all the seat count that you need, or do we need to move that up or down depending on the subscription? Because you're going to be locked in once that anniversary date hits. And managing that within PSA is going to become a little bit of a complexity, because essentially you're now going to be billing out, unless you're just doing annual paid monthlies across the board, you could have some annuals that are prepaid on certain dates of the month. So your whole accounts receivable, accounts payable kind of shifts in a lot of ways depending on what you decide to adopt from an operations standpoint. I'll be getting into some recommendations for PSA due to the complexity there, but I just wanted to cover all the new operational complexities that you're going to have to deal with here, essentially because this is so different from what we're used to today under the regular CSP program. So with that, let's transition now into the timelines so you can see a little bit more about when all of this is going to happen. Okay, let's get into some of these timelines now so you can know when this transition is actually going to be occurring. In January of next year, you're going to be able to start to be able to purchase NCE products in your catalog, whether you're an indirect provider or an indirect reseller working with a distributor. With this, Microsoft's offering 2 promotional offers here, which is essentially incentivizing you to move over to NCE earlier rather than later. The first of which is a 5% discount across annuals, and also that price locking. So when March hits, when the price increases are happening across all 365 products, no matter what term you're on, you can actually lock in prices before that happens for that first year term, or if you do a multi-year term, you can lock it in for 3 years potentially as well too. The other one that they're doing essentially just to give people more time is the monthlies at annual rates till July. So essentially they're allowing you to convert to monthlies but not experience that 20% premium until the July timeframe, to give you more time operationally to have these conversations with your customers, to get your tools set up like your PSA for instance. And that's really just come in the past few months here due to the pushback from the community and the big uproar, just because of the complexity being so large and the changes being so grandiose for how you're going to have to explain this to your customers. So with that, you can begin the transition there to NCE during this time frame. March 1st is when the price increases happen. Again, we'll have to wait till about next month here in January to see what exact SKUs we're going to have that price uptick on. We know there's a couple like Office 365 E1 and Business Premium that are moving from $20 to $22. So it'd be a good time frame to go ahead and get your customers on annuals to experience not only the avoidance of the price uptick, but also a discount on top of that, which incorporates the annuals as well too, where you can lock that in. On March 10th of 2022 is when new subs will have to be on NCE. So any new subscription you purchase for a customer will move into the NCE ecosystem. It'll be exposed to essentially those price upticks if you've not gone with an annual before March 1st. And from there, you'll have customers that'll start to stratify certain subscriptions if you're buying them that new, which is why they kind of encourage you to move everything before the March timeframe. In July of 2022 is when you're going to have both new and existing subscriptions move to NCE or be forced to move to NCE based off the end of their term. So essentially any monthlies you have when they re-up in July is when you're going to have to convert them to the new NCE terms, whether that be monthly, paying that premium in July, or going ahead and doing annuals to avoid that premium, but working at that with your customer. In October of 2022, there's not going to be any more incentives issued for any of the legacy SKUs. So anything that you have there potentially that's extending from an annual standpoint won't receive any more incentives or kickbacks if you're part of the silver or gold programs with Microsoft. And then in July of 2023 is basically the end of legacy CSP. And it's this time frame because essentially you could still purchase an annual on legacy before the cutoff point, and obviously that term wouldn't be over till the end of this year. So there's a lot of big changes coming into the next year. If you're working with a distributor, they're likely trying to automate a lot of these changes for you in the sense of the conversion to also handling the promotions, plus the rate plan changes that will be coming in March. What I would recommend though is essentially obviously beginning to start to talk to your customers about that, but also starting to push over all the subscriptions before that March time frame, hopefully, so you can experience both the discounts and just get everybody operational on NCE before you're forced to do so and more of a time crunch scenario. So in that light, I'm going to pivot now into some of the largest concerns that I've experienced. If you've been watching this video, if you're familiar with NCE in the past, you've developed your own myriad of concerns here based off of all the changes that are coming. But I just want to point out some of the major ones here so you can try to think about strategizing them with your business today. Okay, so getting into the concerns here, obviously if you've been following along or if you're familiar with NCE, number one concern in my opinion, and it's expressed widely throughout the community, is liability. Essentially these contracts now being longer terms, a lot of you have been on monthlies with your customers, and it's really hard to get somebody in SMB to move to an annual type of commit model. And the feedback I've heard, which I kind of agree with here, is essentially the lawyer fees in order to draft these types of agreements that a customer will agree to basically eliminates all profitability you could experience from that customer. So it's a tough situation to be in, but essentially you absolutely need to reduce your liability from these types of contracts, either by getting them to prepay if you're going to annual, or getting them to go ahead and be liable for that annual even though they can still pay you monthly. So the biggest thing here is to start having those conversations today with your customers, and really essentially if they don't want to accept that type of agreement, you really have three options here. Number one of which is to assess your liability here, which is essentially saying that if you were on the hook for those subscriptions, if that customer went delinquent or if they left you for another MSP, essentially would you be able to break even? Would you still be profitable? How much money would you be at risk at losing at that particular point in time? And see if that's something that's an acceptable risk to take on. The second option that you have actually is to move that customer direct, so it's their credit card on file, they can control their own seat counts, and they're just liable for that. You're not experiencing the margin anymore from them, and it's breaking away some of the consolidated management that you're providing, but essentially it's reducing your liability altogether while still maintaining them as an overall managed service customer. And then lastly here is to just move them to monthlies, what they are at today, to experience that flexibility. Just preface it by saying if you want to keep that flexibility, it's going to be 20% additional cost. Obviously that makes you a little bit weaker from a stickiness standpoint, just because you may have competitors come in and look at price solely for type of switching costs. So essentially it's kind of the last resort here, but it's your only option if you don't want to have that liability and still provide them with that flexibility as well too. The other big portion of this is obviously the operational complexity that we've touched on here. PSA is a huge concern simply because of the time it's going to take you to create all those products in your product catalog per term, as well as update your agreements, and then put cancellation dates on your existing additions or line items in PSA, and then sync over all of the new line items. Because of the transition, it's a really tedious task, especially because you're going to have different renewal dates now, essentially for every customer, and potentially different renewal dates under different types of products that they purchase under Microsoft as well too. So lots of complexity there, and the transition, another big time suck that we have here as well too, where you have to move from all the legacy SKUs and upgrade them to NCE, and you could have hundreds across all of your customers, or even thousands potentially. So it's just a huge operational overhead in order to get this moved in the first quarter of the next year, and you happen to have a lot of tough conversations with clients about the contracts changing. In a lot of cases though, they may have been hearing these announcements and hearing this around and coming to you, asking you about questions about it. So you need to have a firm kind of story around the basis of going annuals, or some flexible options around some annuals and some monthlies. So I want to shift here now into some of my recommendations, not just be doom and gloom on the whole situation, just to provide more clarity on some of the things that I would do when looking at NCE and the changes, especially around the PSA side of the house, because that's a lot of complexity going on there. So with that, let's pivot in over into the recommendations. Okay, this is the final segment here. I just want to walk through some of the recommendations based off of everything we've been covering up to this point in time. First and foremost, I think you want to go ahead and update your MSA. Essentially, again, number one concern is liability, so we need to start updating our contracts, and you need to start having these conversations with your customers now if you're not already. Talk about these changes coming from Microsoft and the need to push them into an annual agreement where they prepay or they can pay monthly but still be committed for that full term. You also have to understand the seat changes that they have now cannot be as flexible between move ads throughout the year, so you have to establish a cadence of maybe going in and adding all the seats that they think they'll need for the year and adjusting ad hoc. If they need more throughout the year, you can do that and have prorated charges, but just making sure they understand all the changes that are coming down the pipeline. Secondly, here I would recommend talking with your distributor, because they're the ones that you're working with obviously for procuring these licenses, and they're likely to have a lot of the complexity that you're dealing with as well here too, figuring out that with Microsoft and also creating some automation to its extent in the platform that you use to procure those licenses. So that would be things like the actual transition path, and also looking at if they have integrations with PSA, how that's going to look as well too. Essentially, at the end of the day, some of the questions you would want to ask is, how are you handling the transition from the standpoint of upgrading these SKUs to NCE? What are your timelines? They may be different than the ones Microsoft's publicly announced for this. You also ask them about auto renewals and what that looks like from their standpoint, just so you know that they are conforming with auto renewals versus non-auto renewals, or auto renewals being off. It can greatly affect how you operationalize around this. And then also obviously the PSA side of the house, being able to support syncing the products over to PSA that have multiple terms and being able to accommodate for these renewals as well too. Number 3 here, update PSA brings its own side portion here, which is more detailed here, which essentially is kind of a checklist that I would run through here while you're looking at transitioning. First and foremost, you want to determine those commitments per customer. So to say that they're either going to do monthlies, or they're going to do annual prepay, or they're going to do annual paid monthlies. And then from that assessment for a customer, you're going to adjust your agreements or your contracts accordingly, which is to say that if they're going to do an annual prepay, you might start to establish an annual agreement for them in which they go ahead and have that separately for Microsoft services versus your monthly contract that you have with them as well too for the rest of your services. You could also just do annual prepay that still syncs to a monthly agreement, and then you could handle any prorations there as well too. You may not have to adjust your agreements in PSA or your contracts in PSA, but again, I would assess it based off the commitments that you are agreeing to on a per customer basis. Another tedious task here, you want to go ahead and create new products that you're going to be supporting within your PSA tool. It's essentially saying that you're creating all new SKUs for NCE, and you're accommodating for the different types of terms per SKU. So you're going to have a monthly SKU that's a 20% premium rate plan over the annuals, and then you're going to have an annual paid in full and an annual paid monthly as well. And then if you want to get into the 3-year terms, again, you're continuing to extend that as well too, because each of them will have a different price point that you have to work with. And again, the big complexity here again is just that annual paid monthly and monthly are going to be disparate in the sense of the cost for the customer. Then here in January through February, I would take advantage of the promo. Ideally, I would think that you would get most of your customers on the annuals, so you could receive that 5% discount, but then not have to worry about 20% premium that would come in July for those customers. The good part is you do have until July, so if there's customers that you have that are stalling, you don't know what to do, they haven't fully committed to an annual yet, and you don't want to take on that liability, put them on the monthlies. They'll be the same price point as the annual up until that July time frame. That's kind of your hard cutover point to take advantage of that. But I would essentially like to do it for the 5% discount, so you can offer them some price savings as well to kind of alleviate the new complexities moving into this model. The big thing with moving them over then though is that you're going to have to put cancellation dates on your existing line items that you have in ConnectWise, for instance, or if you're using Autotask, you would zero out those line items and put a effective date of whatever date that is you're transitioning to NCE, just so that it stops that legacy subscription completely. And then you add your new line items or additions to your agreements in ConnectWise or line items in Autotask, for instance, to accommodate for the new NCE products along with your new renewal dates and anniversary dates that you'll have as part of those products. And so it's a slow trickle across all of your customers. Ideally, you could get that portion of it done for a majority of your customers during that time frame. So again, you take advantage of those promotions, you get everybody set up on annuals, so at least you don't have to worry about touching those for a certain period of time, and you could still accommodate for increments and seat counts even if you're on annuals by allowing that prorated charge to flow through into the PSA as well at that point in time. Lastly, here in July, you're going to have to adjust your rate plans if you have any customers that are still on the monthlies that will be moving up to that 20% premium in pricing. So essentially, if they have a monthly agreement or monthly contract in PSA, in July is when that promotion is ending for getting the monthlies at annual rates. So if you have anybody on that plan, you'd have to move them up to that 20% premium and adjust your contracts and agreements as far as the line items or additions accordingly. And then lastly there, you would just simply monitor your renewals, which is to say that whenever they're coming up for the re-up, if it's an annual, kind of having a trickle to your customer to say, hey, is this the quantity that you need because you're going to be committed for a year, and making adjustments accordingly based off of that renewal date. So again, a lot of complexity still, but this is kind of more of a simplified view of how you would actually transition and then start to keep track from there of the agreements that you have in place with your customers. And with that, kind of piggyback into the automation of the renewal process. Essentially there again, you run into this anniversary hell where you have the different renewal dates, anniversary dates per customer, per subscription. So it can get very complex to manage. And so any automation you can create here through that process, which is essentially saying that you could automate email notifications to the customer 60, 30, and 7 days out before their renewal to give them a chance to basically re-up and make adjustments to their contract accordingly. You also want automation around when you're going to need to adjust that in PSA. That could be creating a random service ticket within your PSA tool to make sure you go make those adjustments in PSA. Could also be looking at the process of just getting notifications through a Teams webhook or through an email message. You really might have tooling in place to accommodate for this, but this is a large complexity that you're going to have to deal with outside of the initial transition that you really need to start exploring some automation around. And then lastly here, NCE is just a really fluid situation, so even in the past month or two here, they shifted our dates to extend to July with those promos as well too, to give people more time. And I know the community is expressing a huge amount of pushback to Microsoft, so things keep changing in the sense of some of the granular detail. I would ultimately plan for the worst and kind of take this as what's going to happen in the coming year here, If there's any changes that help out with the flexibility that we receive, that'd be great. But I would keep this in mind with the mindset that they're not going to change these terms and that you're going to have to accommodate for this today. So ultimately, the best step, again, going back to number one, is essentially talking with your customers and having these conversations to make sure they understand how this is going to affect their business. I have a blog post that has all the information that I talked about today in a consolidated view that I've been updating periodically as new announcements come out from Microsoft. So definitely stay up to date with that. I'll link that below in this video. If you have any questions or comments about what we went over today, feel free to leave them below. I'm happy to help where I can. And then, like I mentioned, just feel free to stay up to date. You need to keep on track with all the changes that are coming down the pipeline and start to get ahead of this in the sense of your PSA tool along with the contracts that you have with your customer base. So I hope you found this video helpful. Hopefully it was insightful on some of the granular detail around new commerce experience. If you guys like this video and want to see more content around Microsoft and the MSP space, be sure to subscribe. Thanks guys. Have a great day.